Welcome, everyone. I know we still have people joining us, but we'll try to get started. My name is Jennifer Lucas. I'm a trustee with the Barrington Area Library and a member of the Illinois Library Association Trustee Forum. So today we're going to hear from Zachary Benedict. And before I introduce him, just to tell you a couple things, we are being recorded, and following this meeting, you'll receive a copy of the recording and a copy of Zachary's slides. You'll also receive a link to a survey, and we'd love you to complete that survey. Even it has a spot for other topics you want to hear about, because we really want to do things that help you in your role as trustees. And we'll have a time for questions at the end. Zachary's presentation will be about 50 or 60 minutes, and then we'll have an opening time for questions. So let's get started. Zachary Benedict is the president at MKM Architecture and Design, a firm with over 30 years of experience in designing public libraries. With an extensive background in urban sociology, he has dedicated his career to understanding the connection between people and places. Through these efforts, he has lectured nationally to encourage communities to reevaluate the importance of inclusive placemaking. He's even spoken at multiple state library conferences. So we're very lucky to have him with us today. Again, we thank the Illinois Library Trustee Forum for hosting this webinar, and we look forward to hearing your presentation, Zachary. You go ahead.
Share some slides. Give me a thumbs up when you can see that.
Yep, we've got him. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I think the intent of this discussion is to talk through what it means to be inclusive under the umbrella of a building, of a place. Try to understand maybe the responsibility and opportunity that a library possesses in understanding its role in being a leader, I think, in inclusive placemaking within the communities that we hope to support. So the intent of this discussion is maybe to give a more broader look at what we mean when we talk about things like inclusion, and then hopefully end with some more specific examples and strategies on what staff and trustees can consider when they're looking at it and evaluating just how inclusive their buildings are as a place for people of all ages and abilities. One of the things that I think makes this important, and I don't just say this to groups of librarians, I say this hopefully outside of the library world, is public libraries are important, if nothing else, but because they're one of the last democratic spaces in most communities. They're one of the last places you can go and visit without the expectation of purchase or membership. And with that, it becomes a really interesting discussion about inclusion, because the folks who are empowered to manage and oversee these places have, I think, a dying skill set. Right? In a library, you can run into a homeless individual or a CEO within 15 minutes of each other and maybe not even know which one's which. That's a skill set that most entities no longer have, right? The retail sector especially has narrowed down their consumer focus to the degree that they don't have to worry about accommodating people across a wide breadth of personality types, abilities, interests. But here at the library, we do, and it's a skill set that we need to learn how to leverage in a more meaningful way. So I think every good discussion around community and placemaking should start with a quote by Wendell Berry. That's at least my personal philosophy. And this is my favorite one. Wendell says, "I believe that the community, in its fullest sense, a place in all its creatures, is the smallest unit of health. And to speak of the health of an isolated individual is a contradiction in terms." I like that because it starts to talk about health as something that is contextual. And when we're talking about placemaking, what we're really talking about is the context in which we are imposing on the public, how the environment, the built environment, either supports or limits the opportunities of people across all ages, all abilities, all interests. And that community perspective, that contextual understanding of what health is, I think is the most important criteria for having a serious conversation about inclusive placemaking. The reason I say that is because I think humans by nature are hardwired to cooperate, whether we want to admit it or not. Some of us are more stubborn than others, but I think it's a healthy exercise to understand that cooperation is a currency of the human species. We're hardwired to want to cooperate with each other. And one of the things that makes us unique is that in that cooperation, we're one of the few species on this planet that have what biologists call a nesting instinct, meaning we have this predetermined idea of where we go when we call places like home. This is frankly what made it possible for us to be a hunter-gatherer society. You can't leave and go hunt and gather unless we all decide where we're coming back to at night. And that needs to be a predetermined location. Traditionally, those were nests, campsites, and we can see that all over the place. Right? When we use the words like home, we're really talking about our nest, our biological set point of understanding where it is we're going to return to. You see it in modern context with language. When your patrons talk about the library, it's very different when they're talking about our library. And that possessive language is some way to identify that institution, be it a library or a school or a park, as part of their nest. That's how they understand what they belong to in terms of a place, physical environment. And that nesting habit's important to understand because over the last couple decades, we've gotten horrible at building nests for a lot of different reasons. But primarily, I think, because since at least World War II, I think we've started to really misunderstand this idea of the American dream. It's a notion that I think has consistently confused independence for isolation. We desperately wanted to be independent, and the only way we could prove it to each other was to live as isolated as humanly possible. We've defined affluency by how many shared amenities we can privatize. You might consider someone successful if they have a home gym, home office, home school, home theater, all these things that we used to share with one another. But now as a moment of pride and pretentious success, I think in some ways, isolating ourselves, privatizing those experiences has been one of the ways in which our culture has defined this idea of the American dream. What's interesting about that is we find ourselves separated from one another, isolated from each other, and then was forced to build an entire economy that, at least in some ways, comforted us to remind us, in some ways, trick us to think that we're actually connected. Right? This is how social media has been so popularized. We figure out how to reconnect each other on the back end, but what we found is it just didn't have the same effect, both from a placemaking standpoint, but actually from a health standpoint. This is what we used to call economic development. This used to be how we defined effective placemaking. It was an internalized system. You went to a central location to access stuff, goods, services. If you were in need to want to get access to milk, eggs, a hammer, ask a girl out on a date, you knew where a predetermined, predictable location was to access those opportunities. Somewhere along the lines, though, we traded this internalized system for this, an externalized system, one that ironically came with the promise of efficiency. And in some ways, it was more efficient, right? It made it more efficient to transfer goods from market to market. But also at the same time, what it did, seemingly overnight, is it eliminated the ability or opportunity to accidentally socially interact with each other. And at the time, I don't think any of us really realized how important that experience was. In this example, if you were going to go shop for milk, eggs, you could run into someone accidentally on the street who was there to visit the butcher or buy shoes. And those impromptu, almost accidental encounters, in some ways, how we define vibrancy, social interaction, sense of belonging. That's all lost on us here in a destination economy where the only likelihood of you running into someone is if they're at a big box retail buying the same product you are in the same aisle on the same day at the same time. Then we get back in our car, exist in total isolation as we drive back to our home. And removing that from our daily experience has had a dramatic effect on our health and well-being as a society. You can look at this through a couple different lenses. Probably the easiest way to identify this is through what people will call the social determinants of health. These are the things that can identify what is causing health outcomes. And what you'll find in a lot of this research is the vast majority of these determinants have nothing to do with your access to quality clinical care or having good genes, genetically. Well, what the determinants largely show us is that the vast majority of these are defined by the variables that make up your everyday routine. Want to know when you're going to die, as depressing as it sounds? I don't need to know your genetic code. I need to know your zip code. Our physical address, where we live, has much more predictable outcomes on longevity than anything related to clinical care. And this is an indictment on how we've defined and developed communities over the last 100 years. It shouldn't be that easy for you to give me your address and me tell you, likely how long you live, but we can. And it's something that I think moving forward, especially as baby boomers begin to age, will become an increasingly important topic to understand and dissolve this predictability. And I don't think we're going to do it without the help of folks that understand how to accommodate and engage people of all ages and abilities, because it is a dying skill set that now we find ourselves in desperate need of. One of the ways that I think would help this discussion is if we got better at having a universal understanding of what we mean when we say things like well-being. And there's a lot of definitions to this. I think the most helpful and maybe the most widely accepted definition is Gallup Sharecare does a well-being index every year where they measure the well-being of each state respectively and issue a report. In that report and analysis, they define well-being as the intersection of 5 key indicators. There's purpose, liking what you do, being motivated to achieve your goals. There's social well-being, having supportive relationships and love in your life. Third is financial well-being, manage your economic life to reduce stress. Fourth is community well-being, liking where you live and feeling safe, and importantly, having pride in the place in which you call home. And then the fifth one is physical well-being, having good health and energy enough to get things done, what we used to call health. The intersection of these 5 things is how they define a well-being index score. With that score, then you can start to understand what things need to be improved, what things maybe be outperforming other states. And what was interesting is when they started doing this analysis, what we found was rural states, by definition, didn't traditionally have a lower well-being index. Some of the highest well-being scores were coming from some very rural states. What we did find, though, is the most poorest performing states were rural Midwestern states. It wasn't necessarily a rural problem. It tended to be a Midwestern challenge. And again, heightened the urgency of having these discussions in a more open and informative way. The other thing that's interesting that's not necessarily accounted for in that well-being index is when we talk about inclusive placemaking and accessibility, I think largely this idea of disability is misunderstood. About 20% of this country has some form of disability, but only about 5% of that cohort are wheelchair bound, so less than 1% of the population. However, when we talk about especially ADA accessibility, it is largely focused on abled upper body adults that are wheelchair bound. They don't tend to focus on strategies when it comes to placemaking that would accommodate the 30% that have limitations in cognitive functioning, mental or emotional illness that interfere with the activities of daily living. That's a wide majority of those folks identify as disabled in this country, and something that in terms of accessibility is largely goes unaddressed in the design and operation of a facility. Again, something that we are getting better at understanding how we can help support a wider audience of patrons and occupants to these buildings. That's a current dashboard. And looking forward, we also have to acknowledge the fact that we as a society are aging in a way that we probably won't rebound from. You can see there at the bottom right just how fast our population is aging, going from about 14% of our population 65 and older to about 20%. And because of the baby boomers hitting that magical age of 65, while at the same time younger families simply not having children at the rate we once did, we likely will have a percentage of our population in that 20 to 23%, 65 and older, for the next couple generations at least. So this isn't a pig in the python situation where once this generation passes, that we all of a sudden will be younger again. This idea of older adults and an aging society is simply just something that's going to be here for the long haul. And the reason I think that's interesting to this discussion is about 40% of Americans over the age of 75 do have some form of disability. So especially in rural communities where that growth in that population might be twice as much as in the metropolitan areas, this idea of understanding how buildings can support a wider variety of abilities becomes increasingly important. Partly because I think we need to understand that the built environment is a behavioral system. There's a reason milk's in the back of the grocery store. It nudges our behavior in ways that we probably didn't intend to. And retailers know this full and well. We don't know it as well widely when we talk about generic placemaking. A photo like this was presented in a newspaper to preface our team's visit to help a community in Michigan redefine their streetscapes. And I asked to meet this gentleman, and he turned out to be an able-bodied guy who does this every morning before he goes to the gym to exercise. And in his defense, though, you look beyond the car, what do you see? No sidewalks, no street furniture, no signage, no lighting, no people. This road was designed to drive a dog down, and that's the behavior it nudges. So when we talk about these things and we talk about the importance of a civic platform like a library, what we have to ask ourselves is, what behavior are we nudging? And we have to have an opinion about that, because the facility itself can help leverage that behavior. It can help staff incentivize healthy habits and this idea of effective neighborhoods. But in order to do that, we have to acknowledge and accept the fact that the built environment is a behavioral system, one that can encourage and offer opportunity, or it can limit opportunity. And sometimes with some of our most frailest populations, the ones that need us the most. So an interesting way to look at this, I think, is to talk about this in terms of fragility. Nassim Taleb wrote a book about a decade ago, I guess, with this really romantic idea that I think is worth talking about. It was this idea that the English language doesn't have an antonym for the word fragile. We got a lot of words, but not one that means the opposite of that. To be fragile means that the more stress I take on, the more brittle I become. Now, we have words like robust and resilient, and you hear them all the time when we talk about rural community development, especially these resilient strategies. But resilient doesn't mean the opposite of fragile. Resilient means I can take on a little bit more stress before I become brittle and break. It doesn't mean the more stress I endure, the stronger I become. That'd be the opposite of fragile, right? The more stress that I endure, the better off I am because of it. Resilient means that I concede that the system is going to fail, but we figured out a way to kick the can down the road just a little bit longer. And some of these situations, especially in rural America, I don't think we have time to explore a handful of resilient ideas and strategies. We're going to have to figure out how to explore how to be more anti-fragile in these discussions. An example I'll give is in 2019, the healthcare industry has told us that telehealth was probably a decade away until COVID happened. And then all of a sudden, magically, within 2-3 months, we had a fully functioning telehealth ecosystem, an ecosystem that worked fairly well. And that was an anti-fragile response to an emergency, to a pandemic. And we're better off for it. The healthcare system is now better off for it. But to understand the importance of this anti-fragile thinking, when we start talking about the challenge that will be facing your communities and demographic shifts and need to have this sense of belonging, we're going to have to look at these institutions like a library and our civic leaders to say, what anti-fragile strategies should we start to be considering so that we can at least in some ways be better off from these opportunities, as opposed to trying to be as resilient as possible, holding off the inevitable. One way to look at it is, I think, to look at it in terms of kind of its linear nature. So especially when we talk about health, what we tend to do is we think about the healthcare industry, which traditionally has always been this downstream service. If you were sick, you went somewhere and they try to help support and reconcile your illness. But what we're really talking about in this idea of inclusive placemaking is trying to get better and more sophisticated at understanding how to define the optimal living conditions of a neighborhood of people, and instead of reacting to when it fails, to help try to prescribe how to ensure that it doesn't, to move that leadership further upstream, to understand what we fully can articulate the needs that a lot of our marginalized populations have. And instead of trying to figure out how to put more resources into reacting to our community's failure to support them, how can we move this discussion further upstream so that we have some leadership to identify how to prescribe solutions to eliminate the ability of those experiences even occurring? And what you'll find in a lot of communities is they lack that upstream leadership, partly because it takes some courage, partly because they don't have as many individuals that understand the needs of the community in and of itself. I jokingly always say whenever we go to a community and I'm supposed to at least try to understand what challenges they're facing, the last person I want to talk to is an elected official. The first person that I really would like to talk to is to take a librarian out for coffee and understand what they see in terms of what the community needs and what things that aren't available to support the neighborhood, these members within the community. They almost always have a better temperature of what challenges the community are actually facing. And it's that sensitivity, that empathy that we need in terms of upstream leadership. We need to understand how to leverage that knowledge and expertise in a more meaningful and anti-fragile way. So let's talk a little bit about what we mean when we use the phrase inclusive placemaking. This is usually the quote you'll land on when you have some sort of sincere discussion about inclusivity. Vernon Myers says that diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. And I like that quote for a lot of reasons. One is it clearly illustrates the difference, and I think oftentimes those are, at least in some ways, considered one and the same, and they're not. The other thing that's interesting about this quote is it kind of illustrates that it's a linear progression. Before you can be asked to dance, you have to be invited to the party, and there's kind of a sequence to this. The only thing I don't like about this quote is in some way it takes credit for the group's behavior and not the individual's success, right? It says, as a group, you almost want credit to say, well, we invited them to the party. We even asked them to dance. We did our part. But it doesn't say what happened. And like any good choose your own adventure story, I want to know if they said yes. I mean, was there actually dancing? And in this idea of placemaking, that's the important part, the result, right? The sense of understanding if you feel like you belong. In some ways, that's the ultimate metric of effective placemaking. So if diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance, I think this idea of belonging is feeling like you can dance like nobody's watching. You feel that comfortable in your surroundings and the environment and with those that invited you, that you are in some way on an equal playing field and you belong. And that feeling, that sentiment of belonging is everything. That's exactly what we're trying to strive for. The trick is to try to understand what strategies we can employ within the built environment, within the facilities management as this place to help encourage and incentivize this happening more and more and more. And that, at its core, is what inclusive placemaking is. Kind of the evolution of this placemaking is accepting responsibility to create and manage a built environment that can support and engage a diverse collection of people. And those guiding factors regarding the social determinants of health rest in the social economic factors that define our everyday routine. And that routine is important. So oftentimes you'll see images like this, especially at economic development conferences. And, we'll say the one on the left is vibrant, and the one on the right, suburban sprawl. The one on the left is good. The one on the right's bad. And I don't think any of those adjectives are helpful. I think we start taking these conversations more seriously if we start claiming that the image on the right portrays an environment that limits our capacity to cooperate, reduces our ability to develop reciprocal relationships, and in effect diminishes our sense of purpose. And I think that's precisely what that image on the right is doing to a large sector of the population. And there's civic platforms like libraries where I could say the design was doing similar things, at least to a small cohort of patrons, that it's reducing the magic that a library possesses in existing as a platform, an incubator for our opportunity. And that's what we have to get better at, not only offering, but auditing, seeing shortcuts in the system, seeing failures in these places and suggesting some remedies, whether they're large or small, to reduce the chances of providing environments that limit this sense of purpose. One of the ways to do that is to talk about this idea of social capital, right? The idea of social capital is trying in some ways to define a value to these relationships. When we say we feel like we belong, usually that's a reciprocal endeavor, right? It's a two-part, at least, system where you feel like you belong and others agree. And that connection to this social network has an enormous value, not only to the local economy, but how we identify and strategize on placemaking. So how do you do that, at least in the built environment from a placemaking standpoint? And in some ways, I think the kit of parts for this is fairly small. I'd argue you only have about three. First place is home, second place is work, and the third place is like the cheer song where everybody knows your name. And I think we're to the point now where most librarians understand this idea of a third place. But I think it's also helpful for this discussion to talk about these places, these physical environments as realms of activity, and understand what activities each place is responsible for. Home is a realm of privacy. Work, paid or volunteer, is a realm of purpose. Third places, these social hubs, they're intended to be a realm of fellowship, and that's important because not only are there strategies within the design and operation of the facility that can help cultivate this sense of fellowship, maybe more importantly, is there are interesting strategies around its operation and management that can help identify this as a realm of fellowship. The example I always use is that image on the left is of a coffee shop. It's a place called Mather's Cafe. There's a couple of them around the outskirts of Chicago. They were created by the Mathers Foundation a few years ago. And in some ways, it's a senior center disguised as a Starbucks. The word senior appears nowhere. Staff's given a list of words they're not allowed to say, like senior. They have to call them people. And what's more interesting is, at least when it started, is the staff that worked there weren't necessarily incentivized by how good of a cup of coffee they can make. They were encouraged and incentivized by how many backstories they can memorize. Like every good bartender, it's your job to know that Joe comes in every Tuesday at 2:00. It's also your job to know that every Tuesday, Sally comes in at 2:15 to pretend like she's not here for Joe. Now, I've seen this in every library I work in. There's always staff that understand the importance of this skill set, right? And one of the things that I think needs constant reminding to libraries is as much as you want to think that patrons come in because your collections and programming are so outstanding, and they are, for a large group of people that come into your building, that's not why they're there. They're there because you acknowledge them, you see them, you remember that their wife died 3 months ago and you're checking in to see how they feel. You remember what books they like. That's why they're there. Most important part and role a third place can play is that it is a predictable location when the demons of loneliness strike. It's a place you can go to recharge the soul, as Ray Oldenburg liked to say. And we have to understand how to be able to leverage that power. And it is, I think, an undeniable power so that we can impact the lives of people of all ages and abilities. And sometimes the building can get in the way of us doing that in a real successful and meaningful way. To maybe elevate the role of third places, you're seeing an emerging term called anchor institutions. Groups like the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation are getting increasingly interested in this. And what it is trying to understand that not all third places are the same. They don't have the same impact. And I think most librarians understand this. But anchor institutions are third places usually, but that have a higher calling, a higher I think, criteria of what their role is and how they're measuring success. Anchor institutions can be defined as a mechanism for sustainable cooperative networks. They're leveraged operation to ensure the well-being of the community. That's their focus, is trying to understand how they can do what they're intended to do, but at that same time, measure their success by the well-being of the community they hope to serve. So similar to Mathers, what are they doing? Well, they're a coffee shop. But why are they doing it? It's to try to increase happiness, a sense of belonging, and enhanced well-being throughout the community. And I think in that way, librarians are identical. What do you do? Well, we offer access to knowledge, services, programming. Well, why are you doing it? Because we want to exist as an opportunity incubator for as many people as possible. And in doing that, I think we'll see an enormous uptick in the health and well-being of these communities. And it's something that we all, I think, know and can appreciate. But I think a lot of communities tend to undervalue when they talk about the role an anchor institution plays. And we're getting better, I think, at defining that, both in terms of social capital, but also in terms of sustained anti-fragile community development. Another way to think about this, the Aspen Institute a few years ago issued a report that I think did a really nice job of just cleanly summarizing this. Is the emerging value proposition of the public library is built around these three key assets: people, places, and platforms. And the place and the platform only can be successful if they understand what types of people that they can engage with. And if we can only engage with a certain sector of the population, no matter how effective, beautiful these places are, how well the services are through these platforms, we're limiting the impact we can have on the community. A different way to think about it is this sense of belonging is usually misrepresented when we say things like happiness. That's the reason happiness is so important, at least economically, is this idea, this sincere sense of happiness in some way is the result of a sense of belonging. It's your brain telling you, I like it here. I feel valued here. I'm happy. And I think that's an interesting way to talk about placemaking. Jonathan Haidt, in his book, Happiness Hypothesis, had this, I think, helpful anecdotal equation for happiness. He said, happiness is really just a culmination of three things. One is your biological set point. Some people are just happier than others. But the other two are life conditions and voluntary activities. Life conditions really just have to do with more your physical ability, health, network of family, friends. Voluntary activity has to do with the choices in which you are empowered to define your everyday routine. Just like we talked about the social determinants of health, how much independence in that conversation do you have to define how you're engaging the world around you? And both those life conditions and voluntary activities change across your lifespan. They change dramatically when you have an adverse health episode, or your physical abilities either increase or decrease over time. The reason this is interesting is because I think this is in some way the equation for effective placemaking. The problem is when we talk about happiness, I think it's most everyone's instinct to say, well, how can we make people happier? And I don't know if that should be the metric. What you'll find is if we spend all our energy trying to make people happy, what we end up doing is making happy people marginally happier. We don't do much for the unhappy. So given the choice, if we had to pick between increasing happiness and reducing misery, I think it's more effective to focus on how we can reduce misery. The challenge with that is it's a horrible slogan. We can't say, come to the library, we reduce misery. That's not going to add any patrons to the mix or increase traffic through the door. But behind the scenes, at least, how we're defining our success and our impact, I think that's what we're doing. And more importantly, I think, by and large, librarians have a much more accurate understanding of where the misery exists in our communities. And it's something I wish we could take that expertise and leadership and move it further upstream for other people outside the library to better understand. This is maybe a different way to say it, and I like this quote. Wei Weigan said that Main Street Public Libraries become local agents, physical and figurative, through which their community citizens, elite as well as common, accomplish two tasks for local harmony. First, the libraries provided public space to demonstrate and teach social behavior and responsibilities acceptable to the community. Second, they provided a literary space through collections and services that offered models of successful living, problem solving, and an orderly life. At the same time, they peacefully mediated a set of ever-shifting cultural values constantly influenced by inside and outside forces. I like that because I frankly think that's the coolest job description ever, and that's what I think librarians do every day. The trick is to understand and articulate the value in this behavior and just how impactful this leadership and ability to manage these things can be as a functioning and vibrant anchor institution. So how do we prioritize access? This last part here, I want to talk about the importance of understanding how the building can behave and what staff and trustees might be able to do in understanding how their buildings might be improved in hopes of not making a better building, but making a more nimble platform so staff can be more efficient in engaging with people across all ages and abilities. And that at its core is the focus of a building. It's not necessarily to take credit for good architecture. The building is a tool for staff. It's a platform in which you can continue to do the work you're doing. And the hope is that building is not getting in your way. If anything, it should make your ability to engage better. It should improve your access to these folks so that you can be that realm of fellowship for them. So a couple of things that I think are important within this terms of access. First is accessibility isn't always inclusive. What's accessible isn't always equal. So you take, for example, ramps leading up to a building. Yes, they allow people the need a ramp, such as those in strollers, wheelchairs, walkers, canes. But the cost is that they almost always have a separate path of entry into the building. So there's no universal access. There's the normal people front door, and then there's the accessible back door. And that in and of itself, I think, starts to dilute and degrade our goal here of trying to be as inclusive as possible. And that becomes extremely important. If you look through the ADA requirements for accessibility, you'll notice that almost every sketch is infatuated with trying to serve an adult in a wheelchair. And that's important, but that's a fraction of the people that we're trying to support in this discussion. The second is accessibility often puts the burden on the individual. Right? To push a manual wheelchair up a long ramp, it takes much more effort than an able-bodied person walking up a few sets of stairs. And that burden oftentimes is, I think, downplayed and misunderstood. We don't necessarily recognize just how much burden we put on people while telling them, don't worry, the building's fully accessible. It might be, but it can be accessible and exhausting at the same time. So we're not just trying to hit the bare minimum requirement of accessibility. We're trying to provide civic platforms, anchor institutions that can engage people with as much dignity as humanly possible. Third is accessibility is usually ugly. It's designed without aesthetics in mind. We're getting better at this. I think the market is starting to understand the value of this. But traditionally, these accessible designs were far less visually appealing than those intended for able-bodied people. And they look like assisted devices. They look like Band-Aids as afterthoughts to the built environment. And if we can get better at understanding that, we don't need the need for these Band-Aids any longer. The fourth is accessibility provides a limited solution. We've all seen signs like this, right? Don't worry, we're accessible, but you have to go around the back and get a key so that we can come out and fix our environment so that you can come in. And rather than designing for specifics, this idea of universal design uses aesthetically pleasing features to accommodate both people with disabilities and those without. And that's how we measure good design. So really what we're talking about is this idea that public libraries are inclusive civic platforms that are specifically designed to promote community well-being. And they're embracing this role as a civic platform. They're more than just a third place. They're an anchor institution, one that is solely focused on increasing the agency of a broader collection of people. And that agency, that idea of choice is extremely important because the more we can elevate that, the more we can reduce misery by empowering people with agency, the more likely they were going to find some sense of belonging on their own terms. And at the end of the day, I think that's one of the largest burdens of responsibility any anchor institution has. So how do you define good design? How do you look at something and articulate whether or not it's being successful as an inclusive anchor institution? I think effective design is inherently inclusive and measures its success by the breadth and depth of the users it's capable of engaging. Probably the best example of this is the OXO potato peeler. We all have one that kind of looks like this. And most of us, I think, at least hopefully most of us still remember the old metal potato peeler that hurt your hands so bad. Well, when OXO first launched this product, it was designed by an engineer who was making this for his arthritic mother-in-law. And his hope was that he could create a handle for a kitchen instrument that could increase the chances of her using this for longer periods of time without injuring herself. And to OXO's credit, what I thought was interesting about this is they didn't market this as a geriatric kitchen utensil. And quickly became one of the #1 selling products on wedding registries, because if you were in the market for a potato peeler, this was the coolest and best one. But there's a lot of science embedded in this product. There's a reason it's oblong and round. There's a reason those treads are 0.72 inches and not 0.75. All of these decisions made on the back end, on the design side, to help increase the amount of different types of people that could use this over longer periods of time. And that's how we have to think about effective design of anchor institutions, is that there is a lot of embedded science that we hope supports and cultivates a sense of belonging for a wider audience, but we don't want credit for it. I don't necessarily want you to see it in that way, that it's not an assisted device or a Band-Aid to a bad potato peeler. This is just the best potato peeler we could design. And that's how we have to start to talk about what it means when we say effective or inclusive placemaking. So the last thing I wanted to kind of cover before we open up for questions is one resource that I think would be helpful for staff and trustees is having some at least familiarity with this idea of universal design. And I've tried to just offer a quick summary, but it might help you look at your existing buildings through a different lens. And if you're not familiar, this idea of universal design is a composition of the environment that can be assessed, understood, and used to the greatest extent possible by all people, regardless of their age, size, ability, or disability. And traditionally, we've defined 7 key principles to this idea of universal design. First is equitable use. The design is useful and marketable to people with diverse abilities. And this means we provide the same means for all users, identical wherever possible, right? There is not a public front door and an accessible front door. There's only the front door. We avoid segregating and stigmatizing users. Provisions of privacy, security, and safety should be equally available to all users. And making that design appealing is part of the challenge. But that equity is key in the first principle. Second is flexibility in its use. The design accommodates a wide range of individual preferences and abilities. This is key because here we're providing choice, right? And that choice comes in this flexibility. We accommodate right and left-handed use. Facility is user accuracy and precision. We provide adaptability at the user's pace. And this becomes interesting because libraries are unique, especially when we talk about things like universal design, because you're already accommodating such a wide variety of different types of people. To say that the building is flexible and adaptable at their pace is a challenge, right? It's interesting. The one that we always joke about is, the idea that we have the Dewey Decimal System in a children's department, like my 5-year-old son would actually use that to go find his books, is somewhat comical. But he knows where his stuff is, but based on different cognitive wayfinding, different spatial cues and landmarks in the building. So he remembers where his favorite books are, and he has some agency in that, and that's at his pace, and he feels like he is in control in that moment, and then he belongs. And this environment's not pandering to him. It's not treating him below his abilities. He can find his stuff without supervision, and he tells me, leave me alone. I'm going to go read my books over here. And that becomes part of the pride he can possess and the power of an anchor institution, that it allows people at their own pace to have some sense of belonging and independence. The third, and a segue from this idea of wayfinding, is simple, intuitive use. Use of design is easy to understand, regardless of the experience, knowledge, or language skills at any concentration level. So this is the trick to make sure that we eliminate any unnecessary complexity. We're consistent with our expectations and the intuition of the user groups. We accommodate a wide range of literacy and language skills, and that changes from community to community. Arrange information consistent with its importance, so there is some hierarchy of space, and provide effective prompting and feedback during and after each task. In some ways, placemaking is an ongoing experiment. What works today might not work tomorrow. So this idea of feedback is increasingly important. And the building itself has to be nimble enough that staff can start making adjustments. Because as the needs and abilities of your patrons change, and they will, the building has to flex and move and nudge in a different way. And we have to be able to do that on our own terms without an inordinate amount of construction cost or remodeling. The fourth is perceptible information. The design communicates necessary information effectively to the user, regardless of ambient conditions or the user's sensory abilities. So here we can use different modes, especially when you're talking about signage. It can be verbal, tactile, pictorial, and sometimes it feels redundant, but it's not, because each one is a different avenue of information for a different type of person. Provide adequate contrast between essential information and surroundings. There's a whole litany of research on this alone, but it can range from the contrast of color to the simple fact that older adults who are facing early onset dementia have really struggle with words in all capital letters. And just knowing that simple rule sometimes is enough. I can't tell you how many times I've seen large print signs that were in all caps and thought, oh, that's unfortunate. That was an easy fix. We differentiate elements in ways that can be described. We make it easy to give instructions or directions. You've all had the frustration of just the human reality that adults don't like signs. We don't read them. You could put as many signs as you want in the building and still come to the circuit desk and ask where something is. And you need to be able to explain it clearly. And sometimes that's one of the biggest benefits to having some iconic landmarks within a building. It's no different than trying to give instructions in your neighborhood as a child. Where's the park? Well, you go down, take a right after you see the red house, turn left at the school. In a library, the instructions in some ways have to be that simple. Where's the periodicals? Go to the fireplace and turn left. If it's more complicated than that, it becomes really intimidating for a certain sector of the population to even think they can maneuver through an environment that this busy, this loud, this active. The fifth is to have some tolerance for error. The design minimizes hazards and the adverse consequences of accidental or unintended actions. And this is just part of life, especially in a public building like a library. So we arrange elements to minimize hazards and errors. Make sure that hazardous elements are eliminated, isolated, shielded. We provide warnings of hazards and errors, especially in different types of ways. We try to provide fail-safe features and discourage unconscious actions and tasks that require vigilance. And one of the things that I always say is I've never seen a more nimble and brave audience than librarians in trying to understand how to make sure there's a tolerance for error without wrapping everything in bubble wrap. We work with a lot of hospitals at my architecture firm as well. And during COVID, they were reeling and trying to understand how they were going to survive this pandemic and keep the doors open. I never once got that sense from a librarian. They were definitely going to keep the doors open. It just matter how to do it and what adjustments we need to be made because we open the doors tomorrow at 9 a.m. And that mentality, and I think dedication of service has, I think, instilled in you this kind of deep-seated instinct to have some tolerance for error, because that's part of the role of an anchor institution is to accept that whatever happens on the sidewalk happens by the circ desk. Right? That's why you're one of the last democratic spaces, and there will be error in that, and we have to tolerate it to some degree, especially when we talk about inclusion and ability. The sixth one is just provide a low physical effort. The design can be used efficiently and comfortably and with some minimum of fatigue. So allow users to maintain a neutral body position, whatever that position might be for them. Use reasonable operating forces, minimize repetitive actions, sustain physical effort. So, as silly of an example as it might sound, motion opening doors on an accessible entrance. Just this one picture alone, you could argue whether or not it's aesthetically beautiful or right for a library, but physically, technically, right? This is a front door that isn't different from an accessible entrance. This is the main entrance for everyone. It's a vestibule that requires no thought, no effort. You just continue to walk forward, and in some ways is as inclusive as possible. How can you take that mentality across all different types of places, experiences, environments within the building? The last is the size and space for approach and use. Appropriate size and space is provided for approach, reach, manipulation, and use, regardless of the user's body size, posture, or mobility. And there's a lot of helpful strategies, especially in ADA circles, on what this means in terms of use and approach. We want to provide a clear line of sight to important elements, make reach of all components comfortable, accommodate variations of hand grip, of size, provide adequate space for the use of assisted devices and personal assistants that those individuals bring with them into the building, so they don't feel like that they're a burden or their need for these devices are cumbersome on staff or others in the building. And having some sensitivity to that approach and those space needs is critical. So those are kind of the 7 basic principles of universal design. But the hope is you make your building more accommodating to a broad audience that allows the library to be more accessible to the community and minimize the need for special individual accommodations. The hope is that the building should be the thing that ensures everyone feels welcome. That way, the staff doesn't have to constantly ask for forgiveness of the building being limiting while the staff is being accommodating. We provided a series of websites, resources that you'll get in the handout. There is a handful of strategies, checklists that you can use that I don't think any of them are perfect, but they start to help, I think, staff, if they're interested, to start analyzing and auditing just how successful the library is within this discussion. There's even these kind of interesting posters that I think are helpful on the do's and don'ts. Here's 3 on physical accommodations. Don't do this, you should be doing this. Don't ever do this, tend to lean towards this. And these, I think, are probably a little bit more well known than the ones that are for cognitive accommodations. Just to make sure you kind of understand when you have the choice, lean this way, not this way. And there's a whole litany of resources this way. There's a link there at the bottom that I think can help. Again, won't make it fail proof, but it at least starts to help nudge the conversation in a more effective way and set some precedent that the culture is sensitive to this discussion and that it's a priority for how we're managing the institution itself. And that management's becoming more and more interesting. You're starting to see more focus and I think acceptance of this idea that whether we would like it or not, or even care to admit it, most libraries are used as an anchor institution. For example, the vast majority of your internet searches are usually health related by uninsured members of the community who are working together to try to understand, how they can access a better health or reaction to something that they're going through. And that's how the building's being used, whether we want to acknowledge that or not. So when we talk about incentivizing universal design, I think there's a couple of key strategies here. One is in the planning and policy, and we got to consider diversity issues as you plan and evaluate services, and we list some examples here. Second is the physical environment itself, which is what we've been spending most of this morning talking about, just to ensure that physical access, comfort, and safety within the environment is inclusive to people of all ages, abilities, backgrounds. Third is the staff itself. Make sure staff are prepared to work with all patrons and understand what that means. It might, for some, be a different track in understanding staff development and continued education. And the last is resource and technology, ensuring that the publications, websites, services, et cetera, welcome a diverse group and the content is accessible to everyone. And those kind of 4 pillars, while we're focusing on the physical environment today, I kind of think the focus of those that are sincerely interested in this discussion for the continued operation of the library. So in some ways, to kind of oversimplify this discussion, this is less to do, I think, with accessibility or ADA compliance as much as it has to do with understanding how the building itself can reduce some misery in its experience and understanding where that misery might rest and with what populations are disproportionately feeling that frustration or that misery, because those are the same people that are coming to the building because they rely on it to provide some sense of fellowship. So yes, I think we can focus some efforts on increasing happiness, but at the end of the day, this discussion, by and large, is trying to, in some way, figure out how to pinpoint and identify where some of this misery, large and small, occur, and figure out ways in which we can systemically reduce it in hopes that it becomes a happier place for a wider audience. So I think within that discussion, my hope with this conversation was 2 parts. One is that it provides some additional resources for you all to better understand how your building might be more inclusive to a wider audience, but also in some ways, hopefully, redefine the value your team, your building, and the library offer the overall community, the larger community, in terms of being this anchor institution that is committed to being a realm of fellowship, to being a sophisticated third place, to being an anchor institution who, yes, is an opportunity incubator that provides books and services and collection and programming, but it's doing it in a way that is measuring success by the health and well-being of the community. So a couple of takeaways, I think, and then we'll open it up to questions. One is I think it's important to understand the dangers of loneliness and evaluate how the library can better serve as an agent for promotion of social integration. 2 is to do that, we have to embrace this role as an anchor institution and pursue formal strategies aimed at improving the library's ability to foster social interaction and camaraderie across people of all ages and abilities. 3rd is we need to implement innovative ways to promote agency and this idea of independence and choice in a wide variety of patrons that provide them a sense of autonomy within shared environments. And last, we need to enhance libraries' ability to engage the community by providing nimble spaces and staff that can quickly react to the needs of the community as they eventually and ultimately will evolve over time. So first and foremost, I just always try to take this opportunity to thank you, especially the staff, for everything you do. You'll never, I think, fully understand or admit how valuable you are to your communities. But hopefully this conversation helps paint it in maybe a different light. And you can go home today thinking that you're doing good work, because you are. And we see you and we thank you. And with that, I will open it up to questions.
And I think you have one in the Q&A button, but otherwise just let the attendees know how you'd like to hear their questions.
Oh, whatever's easiest. I can try to track this Q&A if they keep them coming. First question is, what is it about Midwestern rural areas in particular that create challenges to well-being? Great question. First and foremost is with that well-being index, I showed those 5 examples. We tend to be in a lot of rural communities, especially at the crosshairs of a couple different semi-related challenges. So not only do we have a traditionally and consistently poor health within the population, where we spike and have a higher sense of chronic disease in most Midwestern states, but we also lack resources and investment in shared civic platforms like libraries. So we're increasingly lonelier than some of our other cohort states. And third is economically, especially in a rural setting, we're facing some challenges. So when those 3 things start to overlap within this conversation of well-being, it becomes an extreme challenge. And the silly example I'll give you is that well-being index. They usually do their annual reports by state. In 2017, they did one by metro area. And in that metro area study, they studied 180 cities in the country. And out of the 180, Fort Wayne, Indiana, my hometown, placed 180th in the social well-being category, which was asking residents if they had love in their life. And we locally here saw that and really took some serious reflection on what that meant. And it in some ways became an economic development strategy for us, because that was something we wanted to reconcile, we wanted to fix, because we knew just that loneliness alone, how much it would impact not only the quality of life of the residents, but the economic vibrancy of the community. So that well-being, I think, has that kind of 2-prong reality to it, that that for a lot of different factors, there's a higher probability of facing those challenges throughout the Midwest.
Actually, I've asked June to unmute, or she should be able to talk. She has a question for you.
I think the chat is disabled. I was trying to type a question, so I couldn't type it there if I was supposed to. So I'll just do verbal. I was just wondering, are there resources that can show, is there a good resource or website to show different entrances that are accessible to all?
There should be, if when you get the handout that you saw today, at the bottom of almost every page is a hyperlink. And some of those resources, there should be one that's almost entirely focused on entrances. But if you can't find it, we'll share my contact information too, and just feel free to shoot me an email.
And you have quite a few questions in the Q&A now.
Oh, you want me to read these? Let's see. Exactly what do you mean by the library being an agency? No, what I mean by that is the library should try to incentivize a sense of agency within patrons, meaning the more we can have their participation within civic platforms to feel as though it's on their terms and not the library or the manager of the place, the more success you'll have. And that sense of agency is a pretty scalable idea. I think the more humorous example is there's these great documentaries showing how people behave in public parks. And what they found is people sit longer in movable seating than they do fixed seating. And what's funny to me about it is when you see how they use this seating, almost every human adult that grabs a movable seat in a park will move it before they sit down, but they only move it 2 to 3 inches, but almost like to say this is in the wrong spot, and they fix it by nudging it, an inch to the left. And there is some part of the human condition where they want some agency, some ownership in their environment. So to the degree we can allow them to manipulate that and know that it's on their own terms, the more comfortable they will be, the more confident they will be, and the more likely they are to stay longer and return. And I think librarians do that tremendously well already. But in some ways, I think the building can become really cumbersome to that discussion. So this idea of agency is simply nothing more than to say when we can, to make decisions to empower people to manipulate the environment on their own terms. How can design work with permanent infrastructure when there is limited budgets to make changes? The vestibule on the last slide was beautiful, but I imagine expensive when a building is several decades old. Yeah, so it's a challenge. I mean, accessible entrances are probably the #1 challenge for libraries, especially Carnegie institutions, because the majority of them are required to be elevated for different reasons, which meant you have these large grand entry stairs. We've dealt with those in a lot of buildings, and solving those problems are not usually economical. But there is some strategies there. There are increasingly cheaper retrofits for like ADA access door operators that we can now install in heavier historic doors. But having a 100-year-old building is always going to be a challenge in terms of physical accessibility. And I'll add to that is there is also probably a lot of discussion that's worthy to be had around cognitive ability and the built environment's impact on that. So, and those tend to be cheaper things to solve, but more frequently missed and misunderstood. And one example would be, I can't tell you how many libraries I've walked in where I know that the carpet selections would be extremely problematic for a child with autism. And that's a cheap fix, but it's not something that is usually talked about when you're picking carpet colors. And something that seems so innocent can really change, I think, the experience for certain people within the building. Often libraries are historic buildings within the community. How do you increase accessibility without compromising the look of the original building? Yeah, that's a challenge. But I don't think necessarily impossible. Meaning I don't think just to say it looks historical means it's necessarily going to be inaccessible. What you'll find is, especially when we talk about physical access, the bigger challenges are the location and spatial organization of plumbing, toilets, drinking fountains, that kind of thing, and widths and access through doorways and openings. You can solve all those problems while remaining historically accurate, but depending on how you're funding those types of projects, you can get different responses of what should and shouldn't be part of the historic character of the building, or what should be discernibly different because it's a modern integration within the building. So, we can widen doorways and replicate historic casings and moldings, and no one would know the difference. The bigger challenge is trying to understand how to handle these predictable challenges. All historic buildings have differing levels, plumbing, heating, all these kind of concerns that I think if you're thoughtful about it, most of the time you can conceal them so they're not an obvious adaptation to the building, but it does require some thought.
Zachary, we have a question from Joy Wagner.
Hi there. My question is also in the Q&A, but when I heard that it wasn't going through, I decided to raise my hand. I'm curious what motivated you to take this mission on, I know that I believe that our missions are very much aligned in terms of the building that we built for the nonprofit that I run. And I know what motivated me is how it impacted my life and my patients. So what possessed you to become so knowledgeable in this area?
Well, two parts, Joy. One is, should be a disclaimer I probably should start with. My mother's a librarian, so that I come with that baggage of it maybe, but different from that as an architect, our team, the answer I give to this question, we love that TV show Planet Earth with David Attenborough. It's my favorite show on the planet. And we were joking one night that we wished we could watch an episode on humans where he would like narrate us at the grocery store and talk about us. And then the more we joked about that and romanticized about how funny that would be, we realized that if he were to do a show like that, he wouldn't call architects to talk about these people, which is kind of depressing for an architect who spent his life, thinking about this. And we desperately thought, we wish architects could talk about the optimal living conditions of a neighborhood of people, just like a biologist might talk about the optimal living conditions for a school of fish. So about 10 years ago, we reshaped the structure and strategy and mission of our firm, and essentially has made every decision since, hoping that one day we deserve a phone call from David Attenborough. When you come to my office, there's actually like a 20-foot mural of a school of fish. So in some ways, I think architecture is nothing more than trying to understand how best to nudge the creation of the built environment to elevate the quality of life of the people it claims to serve. And that's where I think we just need to be better at. I look at that zip code analysis data and think that's an indictment of the architecture profession. We got skin in that game. You shouldn't be able to tell me your address and me tell you when you're going to die, but in some ways I can. And we just thought that was a burden of responsibility we should take head on. So over the last 10, 15 years, that's what we've done. We have a research initiative in the office, and we just consistently try to get better at understanding how these nests, like how we build these nests for ourselves, can help cultivate some sense of belonging and health. And I think that's the burden of architecture. I'm obsessed with libraries because I see that as the most effective tool, both to communicate and realize a healthier place, community for folks, partly because of the building and its democratic nature, but more importantly because of its staff and their willingness to understand the value proposition of an anchor institution. What about electric bathroom doors? Are they overall helpful, or do they lead to people getting accidentally hit? Yep. You'll run into that, especially ones that are in tight corners, like when they do like the L shape where you go around a corner. One of the things that we're doing a lot in some retrofits, if you have space, is doorless restrooms, especially ones that have multiple stalls. And there are aesthetic ways to handle that, so it's not so institutional looking, but you can eliminate the need for a door with enough space. And I think that's probably one of the better ways to try to solve that problem, is to create that. Now, it doesn't help with the discussion of unisex restrooms, which are hard to do without doors, but which is maybe a different conversation. But we've kind of treated that in a couple of different ways. Oh, what effect is color in the library? Is there a light level that needs to be throughout the library? Yes, that could be a whole presentation by itself. Color theory is actually pretty controversial. There's not even a good resource for behavioral health facilities on color theory specifically. What we find, though, is by and large, if you need some rules of thumb, is to always lean towards more natural tones. So pastels, earth tones, a larger breadth of the population is more comfortable in surroundings that can mimic the colors that you would instinctively see over time in nature. So that's important. And then light levels are interesting. You can say you need 100-foot candles per square foot, and that's true, but with the increasing quality of technology for like LED lighting. The other thing that I think is important is the ability to have multiple settings or dimmable lighting so that we can adjust for different types of events and audiences, because you need more light levels for an aging eye. But if you wanted a sensory room, or you wanted to be able to dim the lights for a story time so it wasn't so distracting or alarming, you want that ability and freedom too, which 10 years ago would have been expensive, but almost all that stuff is dimmable right out of the box as soon as you install it. So I think some of the recent improvements to lighting itself has made that much more flexible. But nothing can replace natural light either. So I don't want that to go not said.
I think we need to scroll up in the Q&A, Alicia, or if she wants to say hers verbally. I think your Q&A is getting scrolled down, Zachary. So look to the top of it and see one from Alicia Tim.
In a time when the very existence of taxpayer-supported public libraries is being challenged, how do you promote libraries to the greater community is vital for the accessible services that we provide? And how do we reach these people that most need our services? All right, that's a two-parter. Let's do them separate. How do we promote libraries to the greater community as vital for the accessible services we provide? This, I think, is when we talk about upstream leadership, this is precisely what we're talking about. I encourage librarians to, at least for a thought experiment, try to live in the mind of someone that was either a retail focused for a little bit and or a politician simultaneously. Neither one that I think are usually very comfortable for my typical library clients. But from a retail's perspective, we have to kind of have some sense of understanding what our consumer is, what brings them in the door, what keeps them coming back. And you all know that, but sometimes it's hard to articulate. Second from that, as a politician, if you're running for re-election, you'd be constantly trying to understand how you could justify your performance and the value of the library over the last 4 years so you get reelected. And I think being able to articulate that in a real meaningful way is helpful. An example, I think they still do this. American Library Association used to have a calculator. You could calculate all your free services and provide an actual monetary value for all that. I've seen some of our clients present that type of information when they're requesting bonds and say, we're asking for 12 million, but over 20 years, and I just gave you $20 million of free service last year. And here's, a 12-page report outlining all the services we provide and what we do for the community that no one else does. And in some ways, I think that's important to be able to articulate that value, like any for-profit institution might if they were asking for investment. And that, I think, is something that if we could couple that understanding and be able to articulate value with some of the information we shared today about the what I'll call clinical value of a vibrant third place, you can lump those two things together, and I think really have a compelling story of what the value proposition of a library is. I know that is really uncomfortable for a lot of folks and not something that they're accustomed to, but I think that's the battle that we're fighting in a lot of these, especially rural settings, that we're just going to have to be better at. So when we do a library project, I try my best never to speak in public because I don't want the out-of-town expert to be the one to say important things and then leave when a project's done. We constantly are trying to help coach and empower the director of a library to be the one saying these things, because they're the ones that actually are responsible and we should be grateful for moving forward. And they'll be the stewards and champions of this in the future. So just being able to articulate that in some way, I think's important. Is there a way to accommodate community seasoned people with a room of their own, and how do you set it up, and how do we put it in to fit their needs? I assume by community seasoned people, we were talking older adults.
Connie, I've unmuted you, so feel free to speak.
Yes, the senior citizen.
Yep, I like that phrase. Here's my response to this. I'd be careful about isolating them, as careful as I am about isolating teens. And the reason I say that is there is some benefits to having their own space, but in a good chunk of instances, it doesn't outweigh the benefits of being integrated with the larger patron mix. So the example I'll give is, because teens operate about the same percentages, about 17% of older adults are even willing to walk into a building that has a sign labeling it a senior center. And they'll precisely say they're not coming because it's for old people. That's a challenge, and why the Mather's Cafe example I gave you is so successful is it's designed for seniors, but it doesn't say it's only for seniors, and that gets you the other 83% that wouldn't go into anything labeled a senior center. We see similar percentages about teens willing to be in places called teen zones. It's kind of almost a corny 80-20 rule. So yeah, it can be useful, but I don't think it should be a strategy where you think you can exhaust all access and accommodations for that population. What's more interesting to me is to make sure that a library is designed in a way that a older adult feels comfortable anywhere in the building. So even if it's not, I won't put an adult chair anywhere in a building that doesn't have 2 armrests, because I know an 85-year-old woman will have trouble getting out of it. And I don't care where the chair is, because you want to make sure that their independence spans from edge to edge within the building. Now, what we can do, and especially in a lot of rural libraries, this is an issue, is try to understand how we can have what I'll call time-specific areas. Most libraries don't have enough square footage to just start allocating certain areas for certain populations. Their buildings aren't big enough. But what you'll find is those types of populations tend to visit the library different times a day. Early morning is higher usage by older adults. 3 o'clock, depending on your location, you get bombarded with teenagers, and the building gets used in different ways. So one of the ways to think through that is, how can we provide, even if we're talking like lounge areas, how can we provide those in a flexible way that they function really well for older adults early in the morning, but it's exactly where the teens hang out from 3 to 5 at night, and try to understand how to do that without segmenting and using signage as a way to differentiate different tribes of people that should never be interact with one another. Any good resources for researching grants or funding for ADA improvements? I'm not a grant writer. No, sorry, I can't help you there. One was asking about receiving the posters for accommodations. When you get the handout of the slide deck, the link at the bottom of the slide takes you to, I think you can even order hard copies of the posters. But we gave you a link to look at them. I was also struck by many of your suggestions to address more of the cognitive concerns can be easily addressed. Carpet changes, font. Can you speak more on this? Yeah, but only out of my own frustration. There isn't a lot of resources available for you on this, and I wish there were more. And this would be a great grant project. But just to give you some clarity, because I think people are obsessed with this idea of ADA accessibility. The accessibility code hasn't changed in a long time, and it was lobbied largely by returning Vietnam vets who had upper body strength but were wheelchair bound. And that's one of the primary reasons that legislation is so focused on wheelchair bound adults with upper body strength. That's why you talk about transfer clearances off wheelchairs and all these things, which is important information to have, but it does very little to even touch the surface on how we should start thinking through the design of buildings for people with cognitive disabilities or challenges. or older adults, frankly. And in some ways, those ADA requirements are counterintuitive to the other populations. So like the example of a 5-foot turning radius for a wheelchair is also an enormous fall hazard for an older adult that's too stubborn to want to use a walker. We give them these big 5-foot turning radiuses, which means I don't have a handrail and I'm walking on what can be a slippery tile floor, and it becomes problematic. So there are ADA requirements, but I think that's different than trying to understand how we can be more cognitively supportive of the building. So a couple of things that there are some resources out there for signage community. I think there's some resources out there that are good. And your buildings live and die by signage in some way. Color selection, you'll find a lot less concrete information on, but I think if you can lean towards more natural palettes, usually you'll be fine. The other one is contrast. So you can actually order these. I think you can still get them for free, but they essentially are like 3D glasses that you put on. It makes everything look like it's black and white. And if something looks harsh in those lenses, what you'll find is folks with some cognitive impairments like dementia, they really struggle with them in terms of like flooring patterns. So like you'll see sometimes people get these carpet borders and patterns in the floor that can be pretty loud. You see them a lot of times in convention halls and that kind of thing. And you can watch these videos on YouTube where people with dementia will walk up to the border in the carpet and then just stand there like they're standing on the edge of a cliff, and they're not going to walk past it. And it's because the contrast is too great. So trying to understand just a baseline understanding of this, or maybe more importantly, just making sure that when you're working with an interior designer or a professional, that you're working with one that understands this and can kind of walk through that with you, I think is important. The last one is acoustics. One of the best things about a library is it can kind of ebb and flow as this quiet place to this really vibrant, loud place full of like giggling and activity. But there's some groups of population, they really struggle with that much activity. So as much as I try to fight the need for quiet rooms for reading, we are more and more trying to figure out how we can leverage sensory rooms for people, young and old, so that they can kind of separate themselves while still being engaged in that platform. So there is resources out there. I wish there was one singular place I could send you that touches all of it. If there is one, I don't know of it. You're going to kind of have to tackle these one at a time in a kind of a more siloed way right now, at least for now.
Okay, correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like we're wrapping up with some praise for your presentation. Kristen, do you see any more questions?
I do not. Any other questions for Zachary?
So there are links in both the chat and now some are appearing in the Q&A. And it's kudos to you, Zachary, that our attendees have all stayed riveted rather than dropping off. We really appreciate your presentation today. And again, everyone will receive a copy of the recording and a copy of the slides. So repeatedly, I heard Zachary tell us to look at the links in the slides and follow up with questions because obviously there's many roads we can go down to investigate these issues further. For the trustees that are on this call, I encourage you to become members of the Illinois Library Association. It's a small $75 fee, and then you get connected with other trustees, get a newsletter, get opportunities for more learning, such as we've had today. So ila.org, and we'll put the links in the chat. I've already put in the chat that our next workshop is April 6th. And that's titled Illinois Library Trustees, What's the Job and What I Wish I Had Known. So you'll hear from some experts. It is hard when you first become a trustee. And even after years of holding the office, there's more things to learn. And our next Illinois Library Trustee Forum meeting is on April 9th. So everyone is welcome to attend those. We have public comment time. It's all open to the public. So again, We encourage you to attend that and consider becoming a member of the Trustee Forum Board. So that's April 9th, and the next workshop is April 6th. Anything else we need to remind people? Again, we thank Zachary. We appreciate this great presentation. Anything else, Kristen?
No, everything looks great. Thank you everyone for joining us, and look to your email.
All
Have
right,
a good
thank
rest of your
you.
weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.